Hey everybody, what is going on? Today we have lots of exciting stuff planned. We're going to be continuing with part 2 of our crypto tracking application, today focusing on data visualization instead of data fetching. Most importantly, if you enjoy the content, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe, comment, etc. It really helps out the channel. And then also, if you haven't seen part 1 of this tutorial series, go down in the description and click that link. It'll bring you right to part 1. I can guarantee it'll be entertaining and interesting, as always, and thank you again for your support. Let's get right into it. Now, if you remember what we focused on last time, we first created an account with the CoinMarketCap API that allowed us to fetch some data about current cryptocurrency prices. We then created a Next application where we fetched that data on the server side and then passed that over to the client side, where we, of course, log our data over here. What we're going to focus on today is then taking that data, processing it in a whole bunch of ways, and then giving it to a JavaScript charting library that will render it into something beautiful with some fancy visualizations. Okay, we're first going to start by installing some dependencies, and there's really two that we're going to need here. One called ECharts, which is our main JavaScript charting library, and then one called ECharts for React that allows ECharts to better interface with our application. You can do this by doing a yarn add ECharts, or alternatively, if you are an npm user, you just do npm install ECharts. And then once that's all good to go, do another yarn add ECharts for React. All right, I was thinking of doing something a little bit like this to start out, where each of these different nodes represent the market cap of the cryptocurrency. And then maybe we use some color indication to indicate whether it's increasing or decreasing for the day. And if we go back to our application, we're going to start by making a new directory called components. We could theoretically put our bubble chart directly in this index.tsx file, but you'll find that as your application scales out, that will slowly drive you crazy. So instead, we're creating this components directory. We're going to cd into that, components. We're going to make a new file called, we'll call this bubble chart.tsx. And this is where our component for that actual chart will live. Okay, we first start by creating our component, and that's going to be const bubble chart equals parentheses, arrow, curly braces. What we're then going to do is return. We'll start this out just being a React fragment. This will eventually be our render method for that chart itself, and then we're going to export that bubble chart by default. So export default bubble chart. What this does, this export default, is that when you import it into other files, it'll know exactly the component that you want to export. You'll find that this makes your syntax a little bit more intuitive. You don't need to use curly braces on every import. If you mess up the naming, it's less inclined to just break the thing. I find it also just a lot more straightforward. Okay, we're now going to take the component that we just created and import it into our index page. We can do this by going to the top of our index.tsx page, doing an import bubble chart from, oh, guess what? It found it for us. Look at that. And we can take that bubble chart and let's pop that right into main over here. Okay, let's give this a little wrapper just so it has a place to live. And we can do that by launching our application. And then let's wrap this bubble chart around, let's do a section. Put this bubble chart inside of that section. And then we're going to give it a class name that will attach the styles to it. Now, the way that class names and the way that styles work inside of Next.js is you use this styles dot whatever the name of the class is. This is useful because it allows you to scope CSS to specific components within that application, rather than just having this mess of global CSS where you have to come up with unique names. And again, it will slowly drive you crazy. Okay, let's call this, we're going to do styles, and then we'll do bubble chart, double underscore, let's do wrapper. Now that we have this name, if we pop over to our styles directory, which should come as default with our Next applications, if we go into the home.module.css, let's create a new CSS class. We're going to title this exactly what we marked it as, bubble chart wrapper. We're going to give this a height just so we can get an idea of how big we want it to be. Let's try 20 rem. We use rem because it's responsive sizing. If you use something like pixels, the second you get a bigger screen, it's going to look way off. It'll make your life a lot easier. And we're also going to give this a width of 20. Let's give it a background color just so we can see it. We'll give this a black background color. And if we pop back over to our application, there we go, we have a nice black square. Now chances are we probably want this, at least this time around, to be maybe a bit taller and a bit wider. Let's put this over at 35. And then also make our width 35. We're going to get rid of the background color, and let's try to make this look a little bit more elegant. Let's do a border radius Let's give it about 15 pixels. Again, this doesn't really need to be relative there because chances are, even if the screen's larger, our border radius is going to be quite small. So we're going to keep that at a fixed 15 pixels. Okay, we're now going to give this a little bit of a box shadow so it stands out from the background. You can do this by doing box shadow, and then I'd recommend actually doing 2. And the reason for this is that it kind of starts out very, very light, and then it gets a little bit darker, and it gives it a bit higher of a contrast. I'd recommend play around with these values depending on your personal tastes. The one that I always use for like a light box shadow is I do 0, 2 pixels, 4 pixels, RGBA 000.1, 5, we'll make that our darker one, and then our lighter one, which will sit a little bit on the background. If we do comma, let's make this one a bit larger, 4 pixels, let's try 6 pixels, RGBA 000.1, and let's see if we like the way that that looks. Okay, there we go. That looks like it has a bit more substance than it did before. Now that we have this nice bounding box here, let's give it a title so that users know exactly what that chart is that will live inside of this box. For titles and for fonts, my favorite font in the world is Josephine Sans, but I'd recommend that you go to Google Fonts, find something that suits your taste, and then use that one. Fortunately, Google Fonts gives us an entire rundown of how to incorporate this font into our application. If you just take this import URL thing over here, go over into the globals.css, right at the top of that sheet, just paste that in. You can then grab the second part down here where it says font family, copy that, and then put it down over where this says font family. If you don't want to import an external font, alternatively, you can just use the regular sans serif, or you can maybe use something like Sego UI that looks a little bit better, or Helvetica Bold. Lots of different options out there. I'd recommend find something that you enjoy. Okay, and here's what we're going to do for our header. Let's make this a span, and there's a closing tag, and for a placeholder, let's just put, I don't know, bubble chart. We'll come up with a better name later. What we can then do is go back to our CSS sheet under home module. If we do .bubble chart wrapper, we can then add span, and it'll use styles that only apply to that span on the header. So instead of having to define a new class name, this is usually a lot quicker. If you're used to something like SCSS or SAS, you can use these ampersand operators that make this a lot easier, but we'll talk about that in the future. In the span, let's maybe make a font size of, I don't know, let's try 1.5 rem. That might be a little bit large for us, but let's see if we like it. Okay, and there's our bubble chart. I like that size. Let's make this a little bit darker and a bit more intense. So we're actually going to change our import to make the weight on that more aggressive. Let's try 500. There we go. I also think that the black and white contrast is a bit aggressive there. Let's maybe make the color of that font a little bit softer. If we do hashtag, let's do 373737. That hex value will give us kind of a dark gray. It's a bit less aggressive. Another thing that we can apply on the body that applies to all of our fonts is maybe something like a text shadow to give this a little bit more contrast against the background. We're going to do that by doing text shadow. Let's do 1 pixel, 1 pixel, 1 pixel, RGBA 000.1. Okay, we're now going to add a little bit of a margin to bounce this off from the outside of the box, so it looks a bit cleaner. We're going to start by going into our span and then changing the display to something called block. This allows it to behave a little bit more like a regular div, and in that way our margins will apply, much more conventionally. Spans by default, only the horizontal margins will apply, the vertical ones will not. What we can then do is add a margin, and let's do 1.25 rem to start and see if we like that. Okay, that looks pretty good. We're now good to actually start our chart that will live inside of this container. Okay, popping back over to our application, we're going to begin in our bubble chart.tsx by importing some of the dependencies that we need. If we do import react ECharts from ECharts for React, and then we're also going to import the React library itself. So React from React. Now, if you go over to the ECharts examples, you'll notice that it's all actually in vanilla JavaScript, but the concept really remains the same. We create all of our parameters inside of this options variable that basically tells what kind of chart that we want, how we want it to look, just basically sets it up, right? We then pass our data to that, which renders the chart itself. We're going to do the same thing over here in React by using a state. So const option, those are parameters for how we want the chart to look. We're going to do set option in order to assign that value, equals react.useState, and we're going to default this to just an empty object. Now the way that we're going to do this is that when that component loads, we're going to set the option with all the data and the parameters that we need to create the chart. The way that we execute something on load is using the React Lifecycle hooks. If you go through the React documentation, they'll give a really elaborate breakdown on how to use it. In this case, we're just going to do react.useEffect, give that a function, and then right at the end of those curly braces, if you give it an empty bracket, that indicates that, hey, I want this to execute on load. If you put a variable inside of there, this will run every time that variable changes. You can do a return value over here to run when the component is taken off of the DOM. Lots of different options. Admittedly, it's a little bit confusing, but this one should be pretty straightforward. We're going to have a variable to put our options to. So let's do const and then bubble chart options equals this JavaScript object. And then as soon as that is done, we're going to set option with that value. Okay, the way that we then take those options and then give it over to our chart is by using this React ECharts. If we take that and then pop that into our render and then give it a parameter of option equals option, this will take the options that we assign, give it over to the chart, and then render the bubble chart. Okay, to start our options for that chart itself, we're going to create a new key value pair called series. And that series is going to be an array of objects. The series is something like each aspect of the chart. So the aspect that we're going to start out first are these bubbles, and we're going to do that by defining a type of that series. It's going to be called graph, and then a layout for that series, which is going to be force. Okay, we're going to send this some example data just to make sure that it's working properly. If we define a data over here, and this is also going to be an array of objects, and then give it a single data point, let's just see what it looks like. We'll do ID test. And if we pop back over to our chart, you'll notice that we now have this little bubble over here, and it should slide in. There we go. We can assign a few different values to change the aesthetics of this bubble. So to better represent our data, maybe we'll use the size of the bubble to indicate the market cap, and then the color to indicate whether it's increasing or decreasing. We can do this by popping over to our data and then adding a symbol size. Let's give this 30. And then we do an item style, and we can do a color, and let's give it a color of black. And there we go, we have a slightly larger black bubble. Okay, let's take our data and then start making our chart. Because we're using TypeScript, we have to type the prompts that we're getting into this chart. So if we're going to bring in the data, we need to make sure to give it a type. We can do this by creating an interface. We're going to do bubble chart props, and then some curly braces. Now, the type of data that we're getting, if you remember, it's a JavaScript object with something that says status and then data with a whole bunch of information behind it. Now, if you're building an enterprise level application, I'd recommend going through and then individually typing all of those, but because we're just kind of doing something quick, we're going to take the easy way out. And the way that we can do that is by creating some brackets, doing key, string, and then giving that a type of number or string. What this will do is anything that's a JavaScript object, it will accept as a parameter. So it doesn't get the typings of every individual key value pair in that JavaScript object, but it just says, hey, it's a JavaScript object, we're good to go. We can then give that interface to our component by giving that a type, react.fc for functional component, giving those some carets, and then bubble chart props. And we're going to add the prop of data. Okay, we then personally pass the data to our prop by giving it data equals props.data, which is the exact data that we're getting from the server side. Okay, going back to our bubble component, we're going to begin by mapping over data. If you remember looking at the data that we're receiving, it has two different key value pairs, one that's called status and one that is called data. We're going to map over this data part, and that's where we're going to get our nodes. So if we do data.data to get that data key value pair, do for each. We're going to give this a name of O. And then for each of those objects, we're going to push that to a collection area that we're going to call nodes. And that's just going to begin as an empty array. For now, just to make sure that we're getting what we want, we're just going to do a console.log O to see if that's giving us what we need. Okay, you'll notice that we didn't actually save our index.tsx. And then once we do that, we should get the data into our component. And we can see the console.log for all of that mapping. So for each individual object over here, we're going to push something new to nodes. So if we do nodes.push, then let's give that an object. And the things that we're going to access, we'll call this ID. This will be the name of the actual cryptocurrency, and that's under here just called name. So it'll be o.name. What we're also going to do is add the market cap, and we'll make this a value related to symbol size. Let's do o.quote.market cap. And let's divide this by a number just to make sure it's not egregiously large, because I think all of these are upwards of a few million. So let's just divide this by, let's say, 1 million for the time being. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Give this a type of any so it doesn't get pissed at us. Okay, after that, the nodes should have all the values that we need in order to create our data. We're going to switch out this data, test data right here for our nodes. Also, let's give this a little type for the time being so it doesn't get angry at us. Any array. Pop over here, and guess what? We have nothing show up. Okay, a couple of things that we're going to change here. The first is that this typing is not correct. We're not really getting numbers and strings in these key value pairs. We're actually getting objects. So switch this over to any just for the time being. We're also going to up this divider down to, I think, about 10 million or so, just to make those nodes a little bit smaller. And then also our main issue was that this is not quote.market cap, it's actually quote US dollar.market cap to access that correct area of the data that we're getting. And then once we have that, we should get our nodes. Okay, we'll start by fixing a few things here. First, let's put in the labels of the cryptocurrencies so that we know what they are. We can do this by assigning a new key value pair in our nodes. We'll call this name, and it's going to be the same exact value as ID. If we go then into series, we can then set label, not that kind of label, and then show true. There we go. And that's probably a little bit cluttered for most people. So we're going to add in some logic to filter out anything that's really, really small, to the point where we might not even see it. We can do that by putting an if up here, and we're only going to push the node to that array of nodes if it is greater than a certain value. So let's do if, then we'll take the market cap. If that's greater than the value that we're dividing by, which means that if the value, the actual symbol size is less than 1, we're not even going to push it to that array, and therefore it won't be shown. So we put that in here, press save. Okay, and that's a little bit more manageable right now. Okay, I don't know about you, but I'm not a fan of this font choice. So let's go in and change the font a little bit. We can do that by going under label and then setting font family. Let's do Josephine Sans again. And we can also make the font a little bit smaller. So let's do font size. Let's try maybe do 0.6 rem, and then we can make it kind of a darker color to see if we like that better. Let's do color, and then hashtag 373737. Okay, a little bit better. Okay, I think we're a little bit over time here. So what we'll probably do is separate this into one more part where we focus on how to change the colors depending on whether the market cap is increasing or decreasing. Maybe we'll set up a logarithmic logic to keep Bitcoin and Ethereum from just dominating the size of all of these nodes. And then maybe just design it so it looks a little bit better, make it larger, and then decorate the page a bit more. So most importantly, if you enjoyed, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Really, really helps out the channel. And thank you very much. We'll see you next time.